Hello, I'm Jeremy Schaap, and welcome to Sportscentury. There are some places, especially in the American South, that are dominated, haunted even, by the ghost of a single man. Memphis has Elvis Presley, Richmond has Robert E. Lee. And in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, they have Paul Bear Bryant. From the Bryant Museum, down the street onto Bryant Drive, to Bryant-Denny Stadium. Bryant's hold is as strong now as it was during his quarter-century reign as Alabama's head football coach.
We got to get reckless on defense. We just can't stand there and wait for them catching passes. Get that defense ready now. Hands up and hit somebody. Can we get a little rushing to somebody?
When Coach Bryant stood next to you, if you could stop trembling, you certainly paid attention.
His nickname was Bear. Now, what kind of guy, you can imagine a guy that can carry the nickname Bear.
He didn't like phony chatter. He wanted his teams, in his words, cold and deadly.
He believed that players played best when they were driven to the edge. As a result, his practices were virtual death camps.
The idea, of course, was to test their manhood, to put them through a Marine Corps type boot camp. This camp would separate the chaff from the wheat.
His agenda was, if you quit in practice, you'll quit on me in the fourth quarter, and I can't have that.
Get ready, let's get ready, let's get ready.
I missed a block downfield, and I got up and I looked up and there's Bryant coming right at me, and he side body blocked me. He got up and walked away and says, "That's the way you block."
One player who kept messing up the same play every time. Bryant started after him and he started running, and every few steps he'd throw off another piece of his football gear. And by the time he got to the gate, he had on his football shoes and his jock strap, and he climbed that gate. That's the last anybody ever saw of him.
He was the most profane and vulgar and crude speaking person that I've ever been around in my life.
He also was the most driven. At Alabama, Bear Bryant created a pseudo-torture chamber known as the mat room to toughen his players.
He decided we'd have a wrestling class at the university. And of course, the wrestling class was just made up of football players.
If you won, fine, you were through. If you didn't, you wrestled 3 more minutes. And it's got to be sort of like survival of the fittest.
We do sit-ups, not on any mats, on the hard floor until your butt would bleed.
It was a constant in motion, pushing, and players were constantly getting sick.
There would be garbage cans around the room for them to vomit in. There would be no water.
He hired a crusty old man named Smokey Harper. Smokey had 2 theories about injuries. 1, take a cold shower. 2, take an aspirin. And Smokey Harper was from the Bear Bryant School of Pain. If you got it, you're still gonna play with it.
I broke my hand, and he said, "What's wrong with you, little partner?" I said, "Coach, I broke my hand." He said, "You don't run on your hands, do you?" Kept on walking.
The Bryant mystique was enhanced by the tower he had built at the Alabama practice field. From 33 steps up, the Bear had a bird's-eye view, and his lofty perch served as a psychological advantage.
I think the tower was a symbol of, I'm up here and you're down there, and you better not make a misstep, because I'm going to see it.
There was something about the tower that said he's looking at us, and we've got to do it right. Coach and player.
When I think of him up on that tower, I think of him picking that microphone up and saying, "Coach Stones, that's one of the worst drills I've ever seen." You hated to have a drill right under the tower.
It had a chain, and it was kind of a cross, and it had a little metal bar that he hooked it to. If he undid that chain, you could hear the chain come back and go clang. And if you weren't doing what you're supposed to do, he'd come off that tower, and he would put you through one of his gut checks.
He came down one day, I missed the block, and grabbed me by the nose guard and threw me to the ground to symbolize that he could take the biggest guy there down.
Over his 38 years as head coach, Bryant won 323 games, which at the time was a record. But his legend was about more than victories.
And we had a function where both teams were together, and I exaggerate this not. Our players at Arkansas would stand in line to get Bear Bryant's autograph.
The door squeaked differently when he opened it. We always knew the sound of the squeak when Coach Bryant opened it, and we all got quiet.
When he walked into the room, it was like walking in church and a priest walking out at the altar. Everyone automatically stood up.
To me, he was like God. I mean, he was a handsome, tough, good-looking man. When he spoke, you listened.
You're not average. You're something special. We don't want you to ever forget that.
One of the keys to his persona was that he could get people to do what he wanted them to do. They were in awe of him, and he knew he had that kind of power.
When we weren't doing so well, or I didn't think that I played so well, I'd cross the street instead of, of meeting him head on. Well, I didn't want to face him.
So we're walking outside the hotel, and Coach Bryant, well, Joe, you got the plan? I said, yes, sir, I think so. You think so? You think so? He said, son, it's time you know. You're supposed to know.
Apparently, this big tackle got in his bad graces, and Bryant goes over to the dorm, goes up to the second floor, opens the window and starts throwing all of his clothes out.
He called one of his defensive backs to go into the game and said, I want you to go in there and break up that little short flare pass. And the player started to strap on his helmet. He said, I'll do my best, coach. And he shoved him back to the bench and said, go sit down. He said, the kid I got out there now is doing his best. He said, I want somebody to go in there and stop it.
It was almost a semi-religious experience. He certainly had me convinced that if I couldn't win on the football field, that I probably wasn't going to do very well in life.
You had a form of brainwashing players, believing that they could win.
The ability to pull people together, unify them, sell them on a single mission, and go do it. Nobody was better at it than Paul William Bryant.
It made you feel good to do things right. It made you feel good to make him happy.
I like to see a smile around. I'm the world's champion frowner, so I'll do the frowning for all of you.
You'll never find anybody that played for Bryant and stayed for the whole thing that wouldn't jump in front of a bullet for him.
There were a lot of former players that were down on their luck, that he found out about it, and somehow he would figure out a way to help them in a way that it didn't come back that he was helping them.
He had a gift for wanting you to know he cared about you. He had a gift for tearing your butt up, but bringing you in his office and asking you how your mom was doing, how your grades were, if you were writing home.
Bryant was a man of seeming contradictions. The coach who drove you to exhaustion, who demanded more than you thought you could give. But he was also the most compassionate person.
Anybody who stayed reaped the rewards of championships, bowl games, and they will swear by Bryant. The ones who left will tell you that he's a no-good, sorry, dirty, rascal dog.
Bryant always had that early fear that he never wanted to go back to being dirt poor. I think that was a driving factor in his personality to succeed. He came up in a tough atmosphere, hard atmosphere, and he was tough and he was hard.
Born to Ida and Monroe Bryant in 1913 in the tiny community of Morrow Bottom, Arkansas, Paul was the 8th of 9 children who survived infancy. The only book in the family's 4-room shack was the Bible.
We had 2 beds as the girls slept together, the boys slept together, and you didn't freeze to death in the wintertime because there were so many cracks in the walls. Paul remembered all that. He didn't ever forget any of that.
His mother was the dominant figure in his life. His father, from early in Bryant's life, was an invalid.
Often depressed, Monroe Bryant cast a pall over his family until the day he died at 46.
They never knew what was the matter with him. Sometimes you'd wake up in the night and Daddy was gone. Sometimes we'd find him way up in the woods wandering around. When he died, he had pneumonia. My mother and Daddy didn't believe in a whole lot in doctors, and Paul always thought had they had a doctor with him, he would have lived.
If not for his mother, they might starve to death. It was his mother who held things together, and I think those family values could be found in his coaching throughout his career.
He loved his mother better than anything in the world because he, above the rest of us, knew what a hard time she had.
The hat was a trademark. He played a Sugar Bowl game one year, and he didn't wear the hat. And they asked him why, and he said his mama told him never to wear a hat inside.
If he had ever done anything to hurt her, offend her, disappoint her, he was still feeling badly about it 40 years later.
The seeds of Bryant's hard shell were sown not only in poverty, but in humiliation.
When he was a young boy, Bryant would have to hitch up the wagon on Saturdays with his mother and go into Fordyce, the only town of any size in the area, and peddle groceries.
The city kids, as Coach Bryant referred to the ones in Fordyce, would taunt him and make fun of him. He was barefooted and wearing old jeans.
He grew up listening to the voices of the kids in town who said, "You're not anything in this world." And it had a profound impact on his life.
I think it affected him his entire life. I think he got up earlier and stayed later because of it.
Craving respect at 13, Bryant took on a challenge that grown men shied from.
When the Carnival Man came to Fordyce, Arkansas, and asked for a volunteer to wrestle the bear, only one guy raised his hand, and that was Bear Bryant.
He never got his $5 for wrestling the bear, but he got a nickname.
He was reckless. He was nakedly aggressive. He really had to work out some of those demons as a young man.
As an end for the Fordyce Redbugs, Bryant's fearless play earned him a scholarship to Alabama, where, playing opposite future Hall of Famer Don Hutson, he made second-team All-SEC as a junior and helped defeat Stanford in the 1935 Rose Bowl. But it was against Tennessee as a senior that the first brick of Bryant's indomitable will on the football field was laid.
He had a broken leg, so he was not supposed to play that day. He played the game of his life. So there was never a moment in Bryant's life that defined him more than that. It said, winning is everything. Winning and control. After 6 years as an assistant at Alabama and Vanderbilt, Bryant served in the Navy during World War II. In 1945, he became Maryland's head coach, but after one season, a clash with the school president forced Bryant to quit. He moved to Kentucky and set up his first military-style training camp.
I was trying to get to sleep somewhere around midnight, and I kept hearing a lot of noise. I went to the window, and I saw suitcases dropping out of the window above me, and then guys going down the drain pipes, escaping from Millersburg.
Bob Game said, I had it, and I'm gonna quit. I'm going out there, I'm gonna whip Coach Bryant. Bob knocked on the door, and he said, what do you want? He said, Coach, I just want to know if I could go home for Christmas. Would that be all right? He said, well, sure, Bob.
Under Bryant, Kentucky won its first Southeastern Conference title in 1950, and then ended Oklahoma's 31-game winning streak in the Sugar Bowl. But the Bears' accomplishments were overshadowed by Lexington's legendary basketball coach, Adolph Rupp, who won 3 national titles between 1948 and 1951.
Basketball always was and always will be #1 at the University of Kentucky.
The final straw was at a team banquet at the end of the year when Rupp had been given a Cadillac. Bryant got a cigarette lighter.
I think Bryant's ego was immense. Almost every move he ever made was based on that. Pure and simple, he left Kentucky because he realized that Adolph Rupp was a bigger fish in the ocean.
He eventually would have gained parity with Adolph Rupp, I think. But why fight that fight when you don't have to? So off he went to Texas A&M.
When Bear Bryant got to Texas A&M, they had a rally for him. He decided to do his own thing. He ripped off his coat and he threw it down, and he ripped off his tie and he threw it down, and then he decided he was going to dance on both of them.
The way he spoke, what he said, in my mind, there was no doubt that within 2 or 3 years we would have a championship football team.
In In 1954, Bryant traded the beauty of the bluegrass for what they called Sing Sing on the Brazos, an all-male military school that had gone 13 years without a conference title. Appalled by a lack of team toughness, he moved preseason camp 250 miles to Junction, Texas, a small town where his players received the surprise of their lives.
They were singing songs and having a good time. They thought they were going to the typical preseason camp.
Junction had been in the grips of a drought for 4 years.
It was nothing. There was no grass in the practice field. It was all, they had to clear away the rocks so the players could work out on the field.
Most coaches, when they got to the gates of Junction, would have realized they were at the gates of hell, and they would have turned around and gone back. Bear Bryant is not normal.
We lived in Quonset huts. I was just about this far from the roof, and I mean, it was hot.
The first day of practice, Coach Bryant had his team in full pads, and they scrimmaged twice that day.
Some players would lose as high as 18, 20 pounds in practice. Of course, most of that was fluid. About every hour, he would dump a bath towel in the water. He'd give a towel to the offense and a towel to the defense, and we'd suck the towel.
In those days, real men didn't drink water. They fed you salt tablets, and those would make you sick.
I got knocked out one time, and last thing I heard as I was going down, somebody said, drag Watson off and get another quarterback in there, you know.
Coach Bryant said, get his tail off the field. He's killing the grass. And the funny thing about it, there wasn't any grass on the field. It was all dirt.
For that 10 days at Junction, I remember him walking off the field many a time with little specks of blood on that T-shirt. And I often wondered whose it was, but didn't have the nerve to ask.
A week into Bear's hellish training, a lineman collapsed on the field due to extreme heat exhaustion.
When Billy Schrader collapsed, I thought he was going to die on the field. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and I just knew I was going to see a friend die.
Coach Bryant did not pay any attention to him whatsoever. He went on with the drill. He didn't come over and look at him.
Basically, what I was told was Bryant said to get this big ox off of the field, and that Bryant kicked me or kicked at me.
The doctor there at the hospital in Junction had, in fact, been anticipating something happening like this and had been storing ice there so that when he got there, they encased Billy in ice and probably saved his life.
The miraculous thing, looking back on it nearly 50 years later, is that no one died at Junction.
It was dehumanizing. It was humiliating. It was all ugly.
Every night we'd go to bed, we'd wake up, it'd be 2 or 3 more guys gone, and they were leaving all in the middle of the night.
By far, the majority of our players were lost to verbal abuse rather than actual physical abuse, even though it was hard.
A lot of these people quit that were talented because they took it personal. When it was not intended, it was to make them a better ball player.
There were 70-something who quit in 10 days. They got back with about 35 players, but in truth, only about 25 of those were healthy enough to start the season.
The 1954 Aggies went 1-9. 2 years later, only 8 of the survivors of Junction were on the undefeated A&M team that won the Southwest Conference. But the original Junction boys remained blood brothers, forever linked to Bryant by what they endured.
There was a bond that formed among those players that may have been unlike any other team in that era.
The team he loved the most was the team that gathered down by the river for the reunion in 1979, and those were the Junction boys. And the reason he loved them the most is because he had the greatest impact on their lives.
I saw Coach Bryant at our 25th reunion. I said, I hated your guts that year. But I said, my having been under your tutelage has helped me as much as any other person or any other thing.
I just went up to him and gave him a big hug. He hugged me back, and he said, you know, he says, I'm so glad that we were able to get together like this because I wasn't sure whether you were going to hug me or hit me.
Junction defined Bryant in many ways. Most importantly, it showed that Bryant was going to do whatever it took to win. It was his will against his players' will, and he was always going to win.
He found out exactly what human limits were in Junction. And I think after he left Texas A&M, Bear Bryant was ready to become a national championship coach.
In 1958, Bear Bryant returned to Tuscaloosa to coach his alma mater. He said it was like Mama had called to say it was time to come home.
Coach Bryant walked in and closed the door, and he started to talk. He said, "Gentlemen, we're starting a new era at the University of Alabama." About that time, the door opened, and 5 players came in, 3 of who were pretty good players. He just turned around and said, "Coach Lassie, help these guys get their bags and get them out of the dorm. They're not on the team anymore."
4 years after inheriting a team that had posted 4 consecutive losing seasons, Bryant led the Crimson Tide to the first of 3 national championships in the 1960s. Despite success, his rules remained ironclad.
I was suspended for the last game and bowl game my junior year because I broke a training rule. If I do let you play, he said, I'll retire after this year because it's going against what I believe in.
We knew that if he would suspend Joe and take him off the football team, there's no telling what he'd do with some of us.
Okay, pass it to go on each side.
I didn't conform to his rules, and as a result, I was suspended. I got a telegram from him that says you have been indefinitely suspended, Coach Paul W. Bryant. I got a telegram the next day from Joe Namath that said he means it.
There was no stars at the University of Alabama. We were all part of the University of Alabama. There was one star, Bear Bryant.
While there were no exceptions to Bryant's rules, he'd broken a few himself at Texas A&M, where he approved illegal inducements to recruits for which the school was placed on probation for 2 years.
The program needed some money to have a little slush fund. Bear Bryant said, I want to find out exactly what your commitment is to Texas A&M. He put the spittoon in the middle of the table, and the boys filled it up with money.
He was not above cheating. I mean, he admitted that, you know, from getting kids into school to making sure that they had enough money to get by.
He wanted to win so badly that he let the alumni do what they wanted to do. And in later years, he was so humiliated by the probation. He felt like that had diminished him as a man. That's really what drove him on the straight and narrow.
While never found guilty of NCAA violations at Alabama, the Saturday Evening Post twice leveled serious charges at Bryant. In October of 1962, it accused the coach of brutality. Then 5 months later, the Post alleged that Bryant and Georgia Athletic Director Wally Butts conspired to fix a game, which the Tide won 35-0.
Never in my life have I attempted to rig or fix any ball game, either as a player or as a coach. Certainly such charges have been derogatory to my integrity and character of not only myself, but to the University of Alabama.
As far as Alabama knowing what Georgia was going to do so Coach Bryant could gamble on the game, there's no truth to that.
I was a sophomore quarterback, called every play of that game, so I knew the game wasn't fixed.
Suing the magazine for libel, Bryant won $300,000 and a published retraction.
Bryant told me that's the worst year he ever spent. And even though he ended up getting money from Saturday Evening Post, he was hurt because it would hurt his family.
Bryant was married since 1935 to Mary Harmon, with whom he had 2 children, May and Paul Jr.
She was a representative of the state's gentry, and he was the poor boy from the sticks in Arkansas. Marrying her was quite an accomplishment. It said that he had arrived as somebody.
She was complaining about him being gone so much. She said, Paul, I'd rather you'd been a ditch digger. He says, I don't want to be a ditch digger. I want to be a football coach.
I think that Mary Harmon meant a lot to Bear Bryant, but football was his first love. And I think their relationship may have suffered just a little bit because of that.
In an era when the personal remained private, even for public figures, Bear played the way he worked, at full throttle.
In 1958, when Bryant was being courted to come back to Alabama, there were a lot of rumors about womanizing, and it almost cost him the job.
He ran with a very good-looking governor of Kentucky, Governor Weatherby at the time. They were great friends, and they went through the state like wildfire.
He lived fast and furious. He liked to drink, and he would have his drinks, but never to interfere with his business.
I think drinking was the way he relaxed. I think he had to have something that brought him down.
He'd get a few drinks in him and he'd think he was invisible. And here's the guy that everybody in the state knew him. Everybody has got a story to tell about running into Coach Bryant after 5.
Bryant would invite you into his suite, and you'd try to stay there and drink him under the table, but you couldn't do it.
We're driving down to Pepperdine, and he really was hungover. And he gets up, and he starts his little speech. And Bryant suddenly stops and says, "I don't know what's happening, but is there a doctor in the house?" And with that, he collapsed.
In the spring of 1978, Bryant checked himself into an alcohol rehabilitation clinic.
He finally was persuaded to give up drinking in the interest of helping the health of a good friend of his who was on the verge of killing himself with booze. And Coach Bryant just made a bet with the friend that if he'd quit, he'd quit. And his doctors had been asking him to do that for years.
He died at 69. And the shock was not that he died at 69, but that he lived that long, because he pushed himself and punished his body at just about every way you can.
Negroes are not satisfied with the second-class citizenship, with segregation.
Alabama created black and white images of racism in America that became an indelible part of our culture and our history.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Back then, we were police dogs, we were fire hoses, burning of the crosses and Ku Klux Klan.
Alabamians began to see themselves on national television, embarrassing themselves, attacking black people with fire hoses. And then on the other side, you had this towering John Wayne-like man with these clean-cut, hard-fighting young men that said to white Alabamians, we can show the world through this football team that we know how to behave.
Throughout the civil rights movement, two figures towered over the state of Alabama: George Wallace and Bear Bryant. In 1963, the governor blocked the schoolhouse door in a symbolic gesture against the integration of the University of Alabama. For the next 8 seasons, including national championship campaigns of 1964 and 65, Bryant's teams remained as white as their pants.
A lot of people probably thought that the lily-white Alabama football team was somehow proof of the rightness of segregation. Bryant hated that.
He maintained white teams much longer than he should have, and frankly, than he needed to politically.
He couldn't have brought them in during the marches and the head beatings. He couldn't have brought them in then because that would only made a bad situation worse. It would have inflamed it.
Paul disagreed with George Wallace over the segregation deal very much. He went to George Wallace and talked to him. Well, I don't think it did any good.
Bear Bryant was one of the few prominent people in Alabama in 1963 who could have told George Wallace to take a flying leap without political consequences. He didn't reject Wallace, but he didn't embrace Wallace.
Alabama was holding out for segregation till the bitter end. And Bryant, believing as he always did that he worked for somebody else, I think Bryant, in that context, could very well have been perceived as less than a believer in integration.
Bryant was always aware of his power, but he knew at that time that it would not be to his advantage to challenge the governor because he would not win. He was waiting for the right time.
To Bryant, the time seemed right in the late 1960s when he began paving the way for his football team to eventually integrate.
He pulled out a list from his desk drawer, and he said, here are the 25 best African-American athletes in the country. You get any of them who want to come to Alabama, I'll take them.
I can say with certainty that Paul Bryant wanted to play black athletes on his football team a long time before he was allowed to.
In 1970, Bryant's first black recruit was a freshman. That September, the Crimson Tide opened the season against Southern Cal, the first integrated team to play at Bama. African-American Sam Cunningham rushed for 135 yards and 2 touchdowns as the Trojans won 42-21 in Birmingham.
That made us start thinking different, it sure did, because we realized that we were losing some super athletes going all over the country that we were not getting.
I don't think the game was designed for that purpose, although it served it. Bryant was definitely impressed. I think all the sellout crowd was impressed. You had to be with what he did that night.
And I think Paul took particular delight in the fact that Cunningham, as he put it, integrated the Alabama football program.
As the next season began, African-American John Mitchell was at defensive end for Alabama.
Coach Bryant was being interviewed by some sports writer, and he asked, well, how many black players do you have on your team? And Coach Bryant replied, I don't have any black players. So the sports writer said, well, how many white players do you have on your squad? Coach Bryant said, I don't have any white players. He said, I only have players.
Martin Luther King preached opportunity. Bear Bryant gave me opportunity.
Coach Bryant had great empathy with some black players, particularly those that came from poor farms and this kind of thing, because that's what Coach Bryant came from.
The integration of Alabama football came after an unprecedented slump for Bryant. While the Crimson Tide didn't lose more than 2 games in a season from 1959 through 67, it lost 13 over the next 3 years.
He knew he had to sign the black athlete because he was coming off of his 2 worst years. In 1973, when he won the national championship, he had 9 all-SEC players. 3 of them were black.
I don't think there's any great social agenda that Bryant was following. He just wanted to win football games.
Third down and 7. One that just missed by Millen behind the line of scrimmage. It's Ogilvy. Touchdown.
When Bryant integrated his team in 1971, he also installed a new offense, the wishbone.
He had all the earmarks of a guy that had just about coached all he wanted to, but he was going to give this wishbone a try. And I think it extended his coaching career.
Bryant made a very impulsive decision to go to the wishbone. And it was a famous meeting with his coaches. He said, we're going to sink or swim with this. And of course, sink or swim meant you damn well better make this work.
With the new offense in place, the Crimson Tide rolled to 8 SEC titles and 2 consensus national championships in the 1970s. In the process, Bryant appeared to mellow.
There was a conscious effort by Coach Bryant to undo part of the image that had no longer become a source of any pride to him.
He wanted to be remembered as a better, approachable citizen than he was a gruff, old, I'll kick your butt if you mess with me type.
Bryant had one of the great second acts in American life. Bryant was this dominant icon, not only for Alabama, but for the South. He was the kind of guy that we wanted our sons to grow up to be like. That sounds hokey in this day and age, but it was true.
Welcome to the Bear Bryant Show. We're glad you could join our review of the exciting action of your University of Alabama's Crimson Tide football.
At 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, the Bear Bryant Show came on. And I think probably 80% of the households in the state of Alabama was watching that show.
And he'd drink his Coke and eat his Golden Flake potato chips and talk to everybody like they were the only person in the world that he was speaking to at the time.
I thought Paul Bryant was a marketing genius. He was the only Southern football coach who ever took the time to go to New York. Go to New York. That's where the media centers were.
He realized all the cameras at that time on the press box level, so he put his team on the other side so he and his team would be facing the cameras and they can get better pictures of him.
But Bryant's sense of his image evaporated in Birmingham in October of 1974, when TCU's Kent Waldrop was paralyzed by Bryant's defense.
He adopted Kent like one of his own players. He raised money for him. He became a very important person in his life.
They raised more money in Alabama than TCU ever spent on me. He came in and would act like nothing was wrong. And then Mom and Dad, years later,
you know, told me he'd go out in the hall and cry with them.
He didn't spend his life, he didn't waste it, he didn't hoard it, he invested. I said, Coach Bryant, I need $70,000 from you to build a home for children. To this day, the Paul Bryant home exists, and there have literally been hundreds of boys come through that home.
Of all the close relationships that Bryant forged with his players, no one was closer to his heart than Pat Trammell, the quarterback of his first national championship team in 1961. Bryant called him, quote, the favorite person of my entire life.
He was the toughest, grittiest, foulest-mouthed, smartest guy. In other words, he was like a Paul Bryant clone.
He was a guy who kind of butted heads with Coach Bryant and challenged him on things, and Coach Bryant just loved Pat. He was like a second son.
And later, when he found out that Trammell was dying of cancer, Bryant was devastated. Over those next few months, he endeavored to spend a lot of time with him. He would go to New York for treatments with Pat.
Following Trammell's death in 1968, Bryant established a foundation to benefit the children of his players. More than 700 sons and daughters have received free educations at Alabama, courtesy of the Bear.
What they didn't realize when they set it up was how massive it was going to be and how many kids was going to come through this program.
Everybody knows about the championships and so forth. Where Coach Bryant's greatness was is that how many players he helped, how many players' children he helped.
The times that we were in directions, we did pretty good. Let's play some directions with Strong and drop our end off over there.
Do I think Paul Bryant was a driven man? Do you think he was anything else? What drove him? To win more games than anybody.
The man has made history. 315 wins.
Being the all-time winningest coach probably meant more to Coach Bryant than I thought it did. He always poo-pooed it, but it meant a lot to him.
He could be the humblest guy in the world, but he could also be the most ambitious. And so that record gave him something to shoot for in his later stages of his life. It gave him a reason to live. It gave him a reason to keep on coaching.
Breaking Amos Alonzo Stagg's record was Bryant's crowning achievement, but the strain of coaching in his 60s began to take its toll. The towering man had suffered from a stroke and heart failure.
Coach Bryant obviously was in declining health, and the team doctors at every practice, they were there. They watched after him. I think everyone knew that his coaching career was near an end, but no one wanted to believe it.
He smoked incessantly and was known to have a dram now and then.
He was strictly a Chesterfield man, and he'd bum a cigarette off me, and I'd have those filters, and he'd call me a sissy and break the filter off.
One time, they were talking about that they wanted him to check and get his arteries in his neck cleaned out, and Bryant supposedly said, well, look, I'm not going to do that. When the good Lord wants me, he'll call me.
His mother was a very fundamentalist Christian lady, but of course, he always resented one thing about religion, is that their teachings forbade medical treatment in those days, and he believed for the rest of his life that that's why his father had suffered needlessly and had died at a very young age. It was the foundation of his struggle with religion for the rest of his life.
He called me and a couple of the other players, and we went down to visit him, and that's when he told us that he was going to try to get a little closer to God.
It was obvious he was concerned about his mortality, and I think intentionally or subconsciously, he was dealing with something he knew he had to deal with.
In his final summer, Bryant returned to the place he'd spent his entire life running from.
Coach Bryant was a roots person. He was continually drawn back to his roots in the Morro Bottom and his mother and his upbringing.
He said, I did a lot of things that I'm not proud of, and he said, I just want you to know how proud I was for people at Fort House that put up with me, that helped me.
I think it was very important to him to tie that all back together in a positive way.
There comes a time in every profession when you need to hang it up
At that time has come to me as head football coach at the University of Alabama.
Bryant's decision to step down was probably the toughest that he ever made. He knew by walking away from the game that in some ways he would be closing a door that he could never open again. He knew the end was coming.
Bryant announced his resignation at the end of the 1982 regular season, but he would coach one more bowl game.
4, 3, 2, 1. The 24th annual Liberty Bowl is history. Paul Bear Bryant goes out a winner in his final game, 21-15, Alabama.
It was just hard for him to stand up 3 hours on the sideline anymore. And after he retired, he said, "I'll croak in a month," and dang if he didn't.
On January 26, 1983, 28 days after coaching his 323rd win, Bryant died of a heart attack. He was 69.
In short order, our switchboard just seized. If you picked up the phone, you'd get no dial tone or maybe a fast busy. But that became a moot point because in short order, all of the Tuscaloosa exchanges went down. And then shortly after that, the entire area code for the state of Alabama went down.
Totally set me back for a while and still get emotional when I think about it.
It was a deep, sad feeling. The only time I've ever been really sadder in my whole life over death was when my father died.
It was almost like I'm finished with what I was put here to do. See ya.
2 days after his death, Alabama bid farewell to the Bear.
Roughly 250,000 people witnessed Bryant's funeral cortege as it went from the church in Tuscaloosa to Elmwood Cemetery in Birmingham.
It was like a combination of the Newton Rockne funeral and the Charles Lindbergh parade after flying the Atlantic.
You'd see truck drivers pull over and get outside and tip their hats as the procession went by. Construction workers on the side of the road would do the same thing.
People on Bryant Drive were almost 10 people deep. Some people crying, waving flags, signs. It was a very emotional trip.
Papa's funeral was the first time I really realized how many people loved him besides me.
You can talk to players today, and they'll tell you, after Bryant's death, when they walked on that field, they looked up at that tower to see if he was there.
The special thing with Coach Bryant is he could look you in the eye, I don't care who you were, and connect. He understood how a man felt. He understood what was inside of guys.
Even though Bear Bryant appeared to be calloused and tough and brutal, ask the people he coached. He gave them a gift. He was forever giving them a gift. And I think that Bear Bryant had a tremendous soul in that regard.
His tactics could come into question at times, but Coach Bryant was a winner, and I'm thankful that I went through that hell at Junction because I got to be under the great Paul Bear Bryant.
When Paul Bryant passed away, he was wearing just one piece of jewelry. It wasn't any of his national championship rings, nor was it a wedding ring, but it was a gold ring, presented to him at the 25-year reunion of the Junction Boys by those who survived the summer heat and his wrath at a remote Texas town. The 1954 Texas A&M Aggies were the only team Bryant ever coached to a losing season. For Sports Century, I'm Jeremy Schaap.